Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of The Bitter Pill, the show where we talk about bitter pills of truth that people don't want to swallow and that the corporate media often doesn't want you to hear about. And it's been a while since I've done a video. It's been a couple of weeks now. I've just been kind of kicking back and trying to do more fun stuff and not obsess so much about politics. And also, I've been wanting to do today's episode for a while, but it was just a little overwhelming to me because there was so much that I could talk about. But anyway, without further ado, the topic of today's video is the term fraud squad too harsh a way to paint the so-called squad, the congressional representatives such as AOC and Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar that go by that appellation in the House of Representatives, and is similar terminology such as fraud or sellout or what have you, too harsh a way to describe similar Democratic politicians such as Bernie Sanders or other progressive Democrats such as Ro Khanna and so forth. And people have been saying that about progressive Democrats in Congress for a while for a number of reasons. And I wanted to talk about what I think about making that judgment about them and applying that terminology to them, and also what are some of the things that people have raised as concerns about whether our left-leaning Democratic representatives in Congress, such as Sanders or AOC, whether they are really representing our interests. So, a couple of episodes ago, I talked about the idea of nonviolence as a guiding principle in both word and deed for the left, and I said that that was a good general guideline in the sense that sometimes being verbally harsh or even engaging in violence, such as, for example, for self-defense, is necessary, but that in general, I argued, in order to build a unified left, and as strong a left as possible, we needed to be gentler with each other and not judge each other so harshly. But I was also careful to reconcile that guiding principle of nonviolence in our words and actions with the guiding principle of this channel, the need to tell people bitter pills of truth about the world we live in and the people who run things in our world, even if those truths involve harsh criticisms of the words and actions of individuals. And using a term like fraud squad is kind of a double-edged sword, because on one hand, if you simply label politicians or anyone else who millions of people look up to and admire and are hopeful will be leaders in enacting progressive change in our society, maybe that's not the most constructive thing to do, because people may tune you out and so forth. But on the other hand, the term fraud means someone or something that is not who or what they are represented or represent themselves as being. So someone might objectively be a fraud in that sense. So how do we talk about that? And so what I want to do today is basically make the case that whether or not you agree that we should use this type of terminology, fraud, sellout, etc., to describe members of Congress who say they are going to fight for our best interests, but then their actions don't necessarily back up those words. I'm going to make the case that whether or not you think that it's appropriate to label them in that way, that indeed the term fraud, in the sense that I've described, is accurate for the squad for Bernie Sanders, for Pramila Jayapal or Ro Khanna or other progressive members of Congress, because there's a discrepancy between the image that they present to us, or how they are presented as being, and the reality of their political record and a lot of their rhetoric. So Bernie Sanders has been in Congress for a very long time now, and so accordingly has a long record that we can examine to decide whether or not we agree with this sort of judgment of him. So he came into Congress with the reputation of being a socialist. He described himself as a democratic socialist, whatever that means, and we'll perhaps get into what that means. And he advocated Medicare for all and a living wage and so forth. He, over the course of his career, has talked about the idea of the importance of grassroots mobilization. During his presidential campaigns, he popularized the slogan, "Not me, us," and talked about how, let me look up his exact words here. In a speech during the 2016 campaign, he said, "This is not about Bernie Sanders. You can have the best president in the history of the world, but that person will not be able to address the problems that we face unless there is a mass movement, a political revolution in this country. Right now, the only pieces of legislation that get to the floor of the House and Senate are sanctioned by big money, Wall Street, the pharmaceutical companies. The only way we win and transform America is when millions of people stand up, as you're doing today, and say, enough is enough." Now, that kind of rhetoric really inspired people and had a lot to do with his, as well as his calling out the Democratic political establishment during that 2016 campaign. It had a lot to do with his becoming the most popular politician in the country. So the question then is, does that rhetoric and does his reputation match up to the reality? And the same could be said of the other members of Congress that I mentioned. So in the case of AOC, similarly, she had a very strong progressive reputation before she was elected. She went to the protests at Standing Rock in protest of the pipeline that the pipeline company wanted to build through the Standing Rock Indian Reservation and under a sensitive water source. She supported Tulsi Gabbard's OFF Act, Off Fossil Fuels Act, to date the only bill put forward in Congress that would basically call for a Green New Deal, that's laid out a plan for getting us off fossil fuels by, I believe it was 2035. AOC belonged to DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America. She gave the impression that she was willing to challenge the Democratic establishment. So I want to just play a little video clip here of something she said early on in her political career. I can't remember if this was before she was elected or during her early time in Congress, early in her first term. But in any case, let's have a look, and you'll get an idea of why she has been so popular and looked to as a leader of the movement for social change, as a leading progressive. So let's see here. do I not have it called up? Maybe not. Let's see. Okay, I guess I closed that video. It's stupid of me.
Back in 2016, we put out a...
They will start to move. Don't people realize that the most powerful position you can be in is when you are not materially attached to a position of power? If you're a one-term Congress member, so what? You can make 10 years worth of change in one term if you're not afraid.
People are saying,
Okay, so you can see there, she is basically saying, yeah, I'm going to go out on a limb here. I'm going to fight for you in Washington by really sticking my neck out and pushing for change, even if it's unpopular among my fellow congresspeople. I'm willing to be a one-term congressperson if that's what it takes to do what's necessary to fight to get a real movement going on for social progress in this country, for Medicare for all and a Green New Deal, and so on and so forth. So that was the rhetoric, for both Bernie and AOC, and similarly for the others in the progressive wing of the Democratic establishment. But what's the reality? The reality is that you can think of all sorts of litmus tests regarding challenging the Democratic Party establishment, standing for principles, promoting grassroots mobilization, doing what you can to engage in battle for progressive legislation, make sure that bills get brought to the floor of the House or Senate for a vote, and so on and so forth. So what's been the record of this progressive wing of the Democratic Party in doing so? Well, let's start with Bernie Sanders, since he's been around for longest. Okay, this is an article I wrote back in 2016, where I said that I was voting for Bernie Sanders because even though I didn't think it was likely that he would win the nomination, he did, for example, talk about the need for mobilizing the grassroots to push for social change, and he had a number of progressive policy proposals. But as I pointed out, his record over the 30-plus years that he's been in Congress was kind of mixed. He started out when he first came into Congress, and I didn't know much about him, being very excited. The first self-proclaimed socialist to be elected to Congress since the mid-20th century, and one who pulled off the rare feat of being elected as an independent, and at the time claimed that he represented a force for politics outside of the Democratic Party. And even though I recognized way back then he was more of a social democrat, i.e. somebody who wants to enact major reforms to capitalism, than a socialist, somebody who wants to get rid of capitalism and have a socialist system, nonetheless, he was one of the rare voices in Congress to challenge the bipartisan consensus to do corporations' bidding. And he was very vocal about Medicare for all, even back then, but it didn't get much traction at the time. But as I went on to say, my enthusiasm for him didn't last. He did a number of things during the 90s and from then on that really kind of turned me off. So, for instance, in 1998, he backed a proposal to dump Vermont's nuclear waste on Sierra Blanca, which is a poor Hispanic community in southern Texas. At roughly that same time, he supported the sanctions against Iraq that killed hundreds of thousands of people. He supported the bombing of Iraq and signed on to a resolution calling for the overthrow of Saddam Hussein. He supported the bombing of Kosovo in the former Yugoslavia. And then, moving on to the 2000s, he backed the Afghanistan war in 2001, was part of that infamous unanimous vote in Senate and unanimous except for one person vote in the House to give George Bush basically carte blanche to do whatever he wanted in the Middle East without further congressional approval, essentially. Sanders supported military aid to Israel. He often voted in favor of the bloated military budget. Backed a couple of George Bush's military budgets and several of Barack Obama's military budgets. He's been a little better about not backing the military budget in recent years, but the point is, he's not calling for the drastic cuts in military spending that you would think somebody who favored social programs over military spending in a country where we spend several times as much on our military as anyone else. He didn't do that. He's also been a very strong supporter of animal agribusiness, the dairy industry and the beef industry and so forth, despite its harm to animals, obviously, and environmental destructiveness, which Bernie has never really talked about. And though he's always held office as an independent, Bernie often acts like a loyal Democrat. He's voted with a party majority over the course of his career over 95% of the time, and he doesn't back third-party or independent candidates. He backs Democrats. And that was part of the deal that he made with the Democratic Party back in the early 90s when he was first elected, that he wouldn't support challenges to the Democratic Party from third-party candidates and so forth, and in turn, they would allow him to be an independent and not run anybody in Vermont, against him. And he's actually been actively hostile to third parties over the years. So, for example, in 2004, he said of John Kerry, the Democratic Party candidate in 2004 against George Bush, not only am I going to vote for John Kerry, I'm going to run around this country and do everything I can to dissuade people from voting for Ralph Nader, who was running for, I guess, the third time for president at the time as a member of the Green Party. I'm going to do everything I can, while I have differences with John Kerry, to make sure that he is elected. And that hostility to third parties continued after that. Let's see, what do I want to show you next? Okay, let's talk about some more current issues. One sort of litmus test that people have talked about as really a test of who's really progressive or not is, do they support freedom of the press, and in particular, do they support freedom for Julian Assange, the founder of WikiLeaks, who blew the whistle, for example, on U.S. war crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan, blew the whistle on the Democratic Party's corruption and their rigging of the 2016 Democratic primaries against Bernie Sanders and in favor of Hillary Clinton, among many other things. And I kept saying blowing the whistle, but he's actually technically a journalist, not a whistleblower, because WikiLeaks publishes things that are anonymously sent to them by whistleblowers, documenting corruption and malfeasance in countries around, governments around the world, and the corporate sector, and so forth. But Bernie Sanders has not been supportive of Julian Assange. He basically refused to say whether he would support Assange, pardon him, or commute his sentence. And the same thing's true basically of most of the rest of the progressives in Congress. Let's see if I can find what I was going to show you here. Just documenting what progressives in Congress have said about Julian Assange on Twitter. I pointed out there have been no tweets about Julian Assange by any members of the squad, by Bernie Sanders or Pramila Jayapal. Ro Khanna has said some things about Julian Assange, basically to the effect that although he shouldn't be put in prison, he thought that Julian Assange had done some bad things in terms of his revelations about the Democratic Party in 2016. I'm sorry, I haven't had an opportunity to look up exactly what Ro Khanna said. But anyway, my point is that nobody in Congress, other than Tulsi Gabbard, who's no longer in Congress, and a couple of Republicans, have ever spoken up unequivocally in support of Julian Assange's freedom and in defense of the principle that the U.S. government shouldn't be going after journalists, shouldn't be going after whistleblowers like Edward Snowden and Chelsea Manning and so forth. Other than Tulsi Gabbard, who's left Congress, there was nobody who was consistently standing up for freedom of the press and freedom of expression in Congress. Another issue that we should look at in assessing whether the squad or Bernie Sanders or other progressives in Congress are who they say they are is how they've gone about talking about the sexual misconduct allegations against Joe Biden. The most famous of which is the one made by Tara Reade in March of last year, when she alleged that Joe Biden groped her and penetrated her digitally, i.e. raped her in the hallway of the Senate in 1993. And Tara has a number of corroborating witnesses who confirm that she told him the story of what happened to her on this occasion and other occasions where Joe Biden had sexually harassed Tara. That they had been told this by her many, many years ago. And it wasn't something that she just came up with last year when Joe Biden was running for president. So let's look at what AOC said. She mentioned Tara's case in May of last year, but it's a little fuzzy what was actually said in the interview that she gave where she was asked about Tara's case. She said, "It certainly seems as though something has happened to Tara Reade. I'm not sure," she said later, adding, "Frankly, this is a messy moment, and I think we need to acknowledge that it is not clear-cut." And it's not clear exactly what AOC meant by that. It's not clear whether she's referring to the political moment not being clear-cut or Tara's allegations not being clear-cut. But then more recently, AOC came forward as a sexual assault survivor and has talked about how, in addition to the nursing home scandal, that the sexual harassment allegations and groping allegations against Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York, were sufficient for her to call for his resignation. However, when she talked about being a sexual assault survivor herself, she didn't mention anything about Tara Reade and hasn't done so since May of last year. Ilhan Omar, another member of the squad, for her part, says she believes Tara Reade but will still vote for Joe Biden against Donald Trump. She said that last May. So you're not really willing to stand for the principle that men who are credibly accused of sexually assaulting women should have those claims investigated and should, if they're found to be deemed to be valid, held accountable for them. She's basically saying, well, yeah, I believe her, but I'm not going to hold Joe Biden accountable. Bernie Sanders, for his part, portrayed Joe Biden as a decent guy who, as his friend, who was just mistaken on certain issues, and not as a corrupt, warmongering, and lying servant of the ruling class that he's been over the past 50 years. He's saying all this last April, several weeks after Tara Reade came out with her allegation that Joe Biden raped her, and a year after Tara and several other women alleged that Joe Biden had sexually harassed them. And Bernie Sanders, up to that point in early to mid-April of last year, when he endorsed Joe Biden and said, well, despite our political differences, I think he's a good candidate. He's my good friend. I think he can beat Donald Trump, and I think it's important that he does. He not a word about Tara Reade's allegations or other allegations of sexual misconduct against Joe Biden. Sanders also dismissed any questioning of Biden's mental fitness for the office of president as, quote, personal attacks, even though there were all sorts of, and have been since then, all sorts of cringeworthy moments when Biden couldn't remember obvious facts, such as the name of the president he served under as vice president, Barack Obama. He couldn't remember what office he was running for. He thought he was running for the Senate for a moment at a campaign event. He sometimes couldn't remember what state he was campaigning in, even though he should have known because there was only one state being campaigned in at the time. And just stumbles over his words a lot, has difficulty communicating clearly and coherently. Yet Bernie Sanders said, if anybody calls that out or brings that up, they're just engaging in personal attacks. And Sanders also refused to criticize Joe Biden for being corrupt. He criticized his supporter and campaign surrogate Zephyr Teachout for writing a column for The Guardian in which she said Joe Biden was corrupt and documented several instances. He said, well, she shouldn't have written that, and Joe Biden's not corrupt. So, and he essentially bullied supporters of his who were resistant to supporting Biden for president when he dropped out, calling anyone who chose to, quote, sit on their hands and not vote for Biden irresponsible. And remember, this is, like 3 weeks after Tara Reade credibly alleged that this so-called very decent man, Sanders' good friend Joe Biden, had raped her in 1993. And you can go down the line. Every other prominent Democrat remained silent about about Tara Reade's allegation for at least a month after she made it. Finally, Sanders was asked about it in an interview with CBS on April 16th. And, in response to a question about whether he agreed with AOC, who had also remained silent until asked by a reporter that it was legitimate and relevant to talk about the allegations, he said, I think it's relevant to talk about anything, and I think any woman who feels that she was assaulted has every right in the world to stand up and make her claims. I just don't know enough about it, Tara Reade's allegations, to comment further. So, a month after the allegations were made, he's saying, I don't know anything about this very serious allegation of personal misconduct against my, quote, good friend Joe Biden, who I'm supporting for president. So apparently Bernie Sanders didn't think he had a responsibility to know enough about a rape allegation against the man he was endorsing for president. He didn't have a responsibility to look into it. When surely he had heard about it by then and had every opportunity to look into it, and abundant corroborating evidence even by that point had emerged that she was telling the truth. And basically, as I said in this tweet back in January, basically there was no real support for Tara Reade. The closest was Ilhan Omar, who said she believed Tara Reade's allegations against Joe Biden, but wasn't going to do anything about them. Oops. Let's see. What do I want to talk about next? Oh, the CARES Act. Another thing that happened back early last year. Of course, we've had the COVID crisis going on for, excuse me, a little over a year now. And this was about the time when last year the first COVID-19 relief bill was passed by Congress, and it was passed by a voice vote in the House of Representatives, I think maybe in the Senate too, where it was almost unanimous, and nobody in Congress cared to insist that there be a recorded vote so we would know who did or didn't vote for it. But basically, this bill amounted to, more than anything else, a bailout for the 1%. It gave away trillions of dollars to the wealthiest individuals and corporations in this country under the guise of, helping people who were desperately suffering because of being laid off or basically having a rough time economically because of COVID. Certainly there was some relief for them. Unemployment benefits were given a somewhat generous subsidy as part of the CARES Act, but there was certainly no aid to people on the level that other countries gave their people. So, let's see. So we just recently had passed, a couple of weeks ago, a $1,400 one-time payment to people. That was means tested. If you make over a certain amount of money, you get less or you get nothing. And the sum total of all the aid that's been given to people other than unemployment benefits over the year that COVID has wrecked our economy is $1,400, $600 plus $1,200 or $3,200 in an entire year. Whereas in other countries, the UK paid 80% of workers' salaries, Denmark 75%, South Korea 70%, Netherlands 90%, Canada gave people a $2,000 a month universal basic income. And one popular way to do it in many of these countries was to simply have the government pick up the tab for the payroll of companies that laid off workers. So even though workers were laid off because it was too dangerous for them to come to work during the lockdowns that took place early on and at various other points during the pandemic, rather than allowing companies to simply fire people who weren't working for them or just lay them off without any help, the governments in these countries took over the payroll of these companies and paid the workers as if the workers were still working. So in any case, the point is that every other country in the world that was able to do it was very generous in taking care of people who suffered economically because of the pandemic. And in addition, all of these countries, unlike the United States, have some variant of universal health care or Medicare for all. The United States doesn't. And it was just estimated the other day that roughly a third of the deaths that have taken place, a third of the 550,000 almost deaths that have taken place due to COVID-19, could have been prevented if people had had health insurance. That a third of those deaths were attributable to people not being able to get the health care they needed when they got sick, or not being able to get tested, or just for various reasons not getting the care that was needed because they didn't have insurance or were underinsured and afraid about costs. So that's another area where none of our progressive Congress people really sufficiently stood up for us. Nobody was, other than Tulsi Gabbard, who left Congress, a couple of Republicans, and some of the progressives in tweets, but not in terms of truly pushing for legislation. There was no effort to get universal help for anybody. There was no effort to even push for temporary Medicare for all due to the pandemic. Nobody tried to do that. Well, what about foreign policy? I mentioned Bernie Sanders' very checkered record in that regard. And let me see if I can find you a list of positions that Bernie has taken over the years. Let's see. So Bernie voted for various military budgets, as I mentioned. He voted for billions of dollars in aid to Israel repeatedly. He supported the sanctions against Iran and Libya in 1996. I've gone over things that I haven't mentioned before. He supported Senate Resolution 85, which urged the U.S. Security Council to take action against Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, basically to overthrow Gaddafi. He favored sanctions against Russia and said the entire world has got to stand up to Putin. He voted for a resolution that passed unanimously in 2014 in the Senate as expressing support for Israel as they were bombing Gaza. no criticism of Israel for the war crimes it was committing. Just said, hey, Israel's our friend. We back Israel. Sanders supported sanctions in Iraq continuously, even in the 90s, even after over 1 million people had lost their lives. Sanders opposed immediate withdrawal from Iraq. Sanders has been a supporter of the F-35 bomber program, which those aircraft are based in Vermont, and I think they might even be built in Vermont, some of them. And let's look at I forgot to mention, Tara Reid said that Bernie Sanders was one of the Congress people that she reached out to early on, before she came out publicly on Katie Halper's and other shows with her allegations. She said she reached out to Bernie Sanders about those allegations back many months before she came out publicly and received no response at all. Some interesting tweets that Bernie has put out there. President George H.W. Bush served our country honorably. He and Barbara will be remembered for their humble and devoted service to the country they loved. So, I mean, this guy George Bush, the father of George W. Bush, he's a war criminal and was director of the CIA for a long time, was directly involved in overthrowing many governments, just a horrible person. But Bernie doesn't think so. And same thing with John McCain. John McCain was an American hero, a man of decency and honor, and a friend of mine. He will be missed not just in the U.S. Senate, but by all Americans who respect integrity and independence. Let's see. Oh, did I forget to? Oh, yeah, I forgot to show you this on the desktop. There you go. Bernie was also a Russiagator. He said, what the Russians did in the 2016 election cycle deserves unconditional condemnation. That includes all their conduct, whether it was active support of any candidate or active opposition to any candidate. As someone who campaigned hard for Hillary Clinton from one end of this country to another, it is an outrage that she had to run against not only Donald Trump, but also the Russian government. The key issues now are how we prevent the unwitting manipulation of our electoral and political system by foreign governments and exposing who is actively consorting with the Russian government's attack on our democracy. So, basically, Bernie is all on board with this made-up bullshit that Russia, in some significant way, interfered with the 2016 presidential election, and that's why Hillary Clinton lost. And meanwhile, he said basically nothing about the actual election interference that was engaged in by his own party. He registered as a Democrat when he ran for president, against him during the 2016 and the 2020 elections. He said nothing in that entire 5-year span, 6 years now, about the rigging of the presidential elections in favor of Hillary Clinton and then later Joe Biden, and against him. He refused to say anything about that. And he's also said, to my knowledge, nothing about Republican interference in elections, where, in the very 2016 election, where he's claiming that, the Russians interfered and, that Hillary Clinton was having to run against not only Donald Trump, but the Russian government, he said nothing about Republican interference in the 2016 election on behalf of Donald Trump, where, as they do in basically every general election, or just elections generally, Republicans engage in massive amounts of voter suppression, as we've talked about on this channel before. And voter suppression is kind of a euphemism for taking away the right to vote of people that a party doesn't want to vote. So, the Republicans over the years, going back at least to 2000, have targeted people of color, particularly African Americans, for vote suppression. Young people have been targeted because they typically vote for Democrats, and poor people. Bernie has had very little to say about that. What about other foreign policy issues besides Russia? Syria. We do not want to make a very complex situation in Syria even worse. I support President Obama's effort to combat the Islamic State in Syria, which Obama was actually helping, while at the same time supporting those in Syria trying to overthrow the brutal dictatorship of Bashar Assad. So, whatever you think about the Syrian government led by Bashar al-Assad, that's the government that is, for better or worse, is the recognized government of Syria, and it's just not legal under international law to call for overthrowing a government that can legitimately claim to be the government of a country. You just can't do that. But Bernie is calling for it. Syria's Bashar Assad's use of chemical weapons against the men, women, and children of his country makes him a war criminal, as I've talked about on the show before, and people at shows like The Gray Zone have talked about in great depth. There's no evidence whatsoever that the Syrian government has used chemical weapons against anybody. And what about Venezuela? Bernie said the Maduro government has waged a violent crackdown on Venezuelan civil society, violated the Constitution by dissolving the National Assembly, and was reelected last year in an election many observers said was fraudulent. The economy is a disaster and millions are migrating. He says, basically none of these things are true other than that the economy is a disaster. And the reason the economy is a disaster is because of the economic sanctions, primarily because of the economic sanctions that I believe he has supported. The United States should support the rule of law, fair elections, and self-determination for the Venezuelan people. We must condemn the use of violence against unarmed protesters and the suppression of dissent. And then he finally does say, he doesn't support trying to overthrow the Venezuelan government, but he repeats basically all of the Donald Trump administration's false talking points regarding Venezuela. Well, what about other members of the progressive wing in the Democratic Party? Well, not much from them on foreign policy either. Tweets about Bolivia's coup, backed by the U.S., that took place in 2019 by Pramila Jayapal or Rashida Tlaib. None. There's basically been expressions of opposition to the coup by some of the progressives in Congress, Bernie Sanders, Ro Khanna, AOC, and some others, but they haven't really talked about the crimes of the government that came into power during the year or so that it held power. They really haven't mentioned Bolivia since they tweeted about the coup. On another important foreign policy issue, the U.S.'s longstanding support for Israel's occupation of and oppression of Palestinians and their land. Basically, Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar two members of the squad, have been okay on this issue. They have said that in principle what Israel's doing is immoral and it needs to end. But nobody else in Congress has really taken such a position, and I'm pretty sure that both Tlaib and Omar support a so-called two-state solution to a state of Israel and a state of Palestine, two separate states, which just isn't, and I don't have time to get into this, so I'll talk about it some other time, but it's not a politically realistic option because Israel's a dominant power, really a secular, democratic, single state consisting of all of the territory in question is really the only solution. But nobody in Congress has come out in support of that. Well, what about Syria? So just recently, Joe Biden his administration engaged in an attack on Syria. They bombed some, I think, essentially Iraqis who were fighting against ISIS in Syria, who were backed by Iran, and it was supposedly in retaliation for an attack on U.S. troops in Iraq, who are in Iraq illegally, just like they're in Syria illegally. And some Democrats did speak out against Joe Biden's his administration's bombing of Iranian-backed militias in eastern Syria. Said he didn't really have any legal justification for the attack because he hadn't sought approval from Congress. Under the U.S. Constitution, whenever a president engages in an act of war, unless some exception has previously been agreed on, the president of the United States cannot take military action unless it's like a national emergency. Somebody's attacked us first. Without congressional approval. And so basically, that's what Bernie Sanders and Ilhan Omar and others have said, is that this strike was illegal. Omar released a statement saying, "I'm deeply concerned about the legal justification of the airstrikes in Syria. Military action in a country where Congress has not authorized war is unconstitutional in almost all circumstances." Let's see. What did AOC say about it? Well, nothing. She did, however, tweet about Syria back when Donald Trump was president. Trump's sudden withdrawal from northern Syria and endorsement of Turkey's actions could have catastrophic consequences and risk laying the ground for immense violence and suffering. We can pursue a strategy to stop our endless wars without endangering the lives of innocent people. And I don't have the statement for you, but she also condemned Trump's bombing of Syria on the same grounds that some members of Congress condemned Biden's bombing of Syria, that it was illegal under U.S. law. It was unconstitutional. But as Aaron Mate from the Gray Zone points out, the only person of political prominence, who condemned U.S. intervention in Syria on a principled basis was Tulsi Gabbard, who's no longer in Congress. So Tulsi made a statement on March 1st after the bombing in Syria, the recent bombing in Syria, that I'm glad some of my former colleagues in Congress are speaking out against the recent unconstitutional airstrikes in Syria, but they're ignoring the bigger issue, the regime change war the U.S. continues to wage in Syria using Al-Qaeda, al-Nusra, HTS terrorists as our proxy. And Aaron comments that Tulsi stands virtually alone in not only criticizing but even acknowledging the modern-day siege of draconian embargo and sanctions that the U.S. is imposing on Syria, causing death and suffering for millions and making it impossible for the Syrian people to try to rebuild. And that, that's a general pattern that you see with the permissible, so to speak, left wing of the Democratic Party in Congress over the years, that they're willing to say, well, this or that policy decision is a mistake. The Vietnam War was a mistake. The bombing of Syria was a mistake, etc. It was unconstitutional because the president didn't seek congressional authorization. But very seldom do you see members of Congress or other politicians condemning such violent acts by U.S. presidents on moral grounds, and they don't look at the whole picture. They're not talking about, as Tulsi Gabbard did, the fact that the U.S. is illegally militarily occupying Syria, occupying their oil fields and preventing them from using their own oil. They're not talking about the horrific economic and human cost of the draconian sanctions that the U.S. is imposing on Syria. They're not talking about just the utter chaos and death and destruction that has rained down on Syria over the last 10 years as a result of the foreign policy supported by Democrats and Republicans alike of the U.S. Towards Syria. They're not really engaged in principled opposition, and a lot of them repeat talking points of this or that administration, that we got to overthrow the Syrian government because Bashar al-Assad's a dictator. Never mind that it would be illegal to do that. Well, let's turn our attention back to domestic policy. Back in early December, Jimmy Dore, a political commentator on YouTube, whose show I would guess many of you who are watching this show watch, proposed the idea that members of the House of Representatives should withhold their vote from Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi for re-election as Speaker of the House, unless she was willing to bring a vote on Medicare for all to the floor of Congress for a vote. And basically the argument is, well, look, we're in the middle of a pandemic. There's never been a better time in recent history to push for universal health care than a pandemic, where we have this massive public health crisis and we have this massive economic crisis where 15 million people have lost their health insurance, and lots of people are uninsured to begin with and are suffering economically. You can't afford medical bills, and also that because the November election resulted in such a close margin of Democrats holding the majority in the House of Representatives, that just a few people could, by virtue of withholding their vote from Nancy Pelosi for re-election to Speaker of the House, could have enormous leverage to exert pressure for this or that policy concession from her. So what Jimmy was saying is, they should withhold their vote for Pelosi to force her to bring Medicare for all up for a vote on the floor of the House. And the upshot was that nobody in among the progressive Democrats in the House is Squad or Ro Khanna or Pramila Jayapal or others, was willing to do that. Pramila Jayapal being the person who authored the Medicare for All bill. She was not willing to use her leverage to put pressure on Nancy Pelosi to bring her own bill up for a vote on the floor of the House of Representatives. And, there was a town hall organized in around the end of December, which 15,000 people initially listened in on. Over 100,000 people eventually listened to it. Basically talking about why we needed Medicare for All and people's stories about their horrible experiences with lacking access to medical care, and the need for there to be a big push to publicize this need by having the first ever open debate on the floor of Congress about Medicare for All, and the need to have people be put on record in terms of a vote up or down for or against Medicare for All, and all the progressive members of Congress, as well as some who were up for election to Congress, like Nina Turner, for example, were invited to virtually attend this Force the Vote town hall. And not only did none of them do so, but none of them even responded to the invitation. So there was just dead silence from almost everybody in Congress about this proposal. The only person who did say anything about it was AOC, but it was not to speak in favor of it. So basically, let's see if I can find, here we go. Justin Jackson, the football player and political activist, had this to say about the Force the Vote movement. If AOC and the Squad don't do what Jimmy Dore has suggested and withhold their vote for Pelosi for speakership unless Medicare for All gets brought to the floor for a vote, they will be revealing themselves. Power concedes nothing without a demand. And AOC actually responded to Justin Jackson. Didn't respond to anybody else, but responded to the professional athlete. Problem with this idea is that there isn't enough thought given to step two. The Dem votes aren't there yet, and with a razor-thin margin, the Dem, I'm not sure what that means, are greater than margin. So you issue threats, hold your vote, and lose. Then what? If you want to know who's opposed, look at the co-sponsor list. So let's see. I'm pretty sure Justin Jackson. In contrast, you can use leverage to push for things that can happen and change lives, i.e. a $15 minimum wage in the first 100 days. Doable. Elevating longtime progressive champions to important positions of leadership. Also doable. That's the opportunity cost to weigh. So Aaron Mate's response to that was, how does losing a vote on Medicare for All take away your leverage to push for things that can happen? You can still push for those things. And who are the longtime progressive champions who stand a chance to be elevated to these important positions of leadership? The answer is none of them got positions of leadership in the House among the progressives. In fact, AOC lost a committee seat. Let's see, I'm looking to see whether Justin Jackson responded to her. I think he might have, but I don't see it. But anyway, the next day, AOC followed up on this, saying, some people say a co-sponsor list isn't genuine, and forcing a vote, even if it fails, will add clarity by putting people on the record, even though co-sponsor list is on the record. Problem is, with a GOP Senate, people can still disingenuously vote because they know it's going to a graveyard. In other words, if the vote's going to lose, people can pretend to be for it and vote for it. But, I mean, suppose, a Like, how does she know it would lose if, there's not only genuine supporters, but people who support gambling, that it won't pass? It has over 100 co-sponsors. So now you've actually made life harder for organizers, because if you suspect a co-sponsor isn't a genuine supporter, you now just gave them a chance to cover when stakes are low. So now they can ward off pressure. Pay attention, actual Medicare for All grassroots organizers haven't pushed for this. Which, I mean, that's an absurd statement, because it's claiming that there's this select group of officially designated grassroots organizers for Medicare for All, and all the people pushing for forced vote, such as Jimmy Dore, such as Crystal Ball, Fiorella from Combo Couch, Justin Jackson, many others on the progressive left were pushing for force the vote. Grassroots organization and pressure campaigns take an insane amount of work and preparation. Key organizing moments may look like random uprisings and viral internet movements to some, but they aren't. They are the result of years of targeted organizing and people's movements aided by present moment, blah, blah, blah. If you want a model on how we can successfully secure floor votes on progressive legislation, is examine how the grassroots just successfully forced and passed a $15 minimum wage in the House, even over conservative Dem objections. So, where's our $15 minimum wage? We're still waiting, AOC. But look what AOC said on January 12th, when the House was voting to impeach Donald Trump for the second time. Impeachment meaning that charges are brought against the president, or whoever it is that's being impeached, and then in this case the Senate tries the case. So someone asked AOC, what's the purpose of a vote like the one on impeachment tonight, where the answer is already known, regardless of the results of the vote? Is it mainly just to get representatives on the record? So basically he's asking, well, what's the point of pushing for impeaching Donald Trump? Okay, well, you're gonna, it's gonna pass the House. He's gonna get impeached, but then, when it comes to trial in the Senate, they're not gonna convict him. They're not gonna boot him out of office or, convict him of the charges made because the Senate doesn't have the votes. So AOC responded, a few reasons. Sometimes it's to get members on the record so people can't make excuses later. Sometimes these votes create real political pressure that forces developments. Sometimes we vote for the historical record to let future generations know we did everything we could. So basically what she's doing here is outlining all the reasons that people gave her that she rejected for the Force the Vote campaign. Those are exactly the same justifications given by Force the Vote advocates, like Jimmy Dore and Justin Jackson and others, for forcing a floor vote on Medicare for All by threatening to withhold votes from Nancy Pelosi, which none of them did. None of the all the progressive members of Congress voted for Nancy Pelosi for Speaker of the House. Those who had been there since 2018 were doing so for the second time. But basically, she's saying, forcing a vote on issues, even though that ultimately you're going to lose. So, even though you have impeached Donald Trump, you don't convict him in the Senate. There's still legitimate reasons for doing that, for the sake of publicity, for the sake of forcing people to go on the record in Congress with a vote, to let future generations know we did everything we could, that we really fought. But she's only willing to do this for a symbolic vote that's not going anywhere on impeachment, but she's not willing to do it for votes on real policy changes like Medicare for All, or like a $15 minimum wage, which she talked about as doable. An opportunity to push for that came up just a couple of months later, And so let's look at what happened with that. So as Comrade Misty at Sarcasm Stardust pointed out on Twitter, please remind me how doable these things that you talked about back in December were. Such as the $15 minimum wage and getting people elected to committees and so forth. You caved on using the leverage you had to force a vote because reasons. What the fuck is the point of the fucking squad? Or she said squat, but I assume she meant squad. Because basically what happened with the later opportunity that they had to, let's see if I can find this here. Okay, so David Sirota talks about how there was an opportunity with the COVID relief bill that just passed in Congress in early March to force the vote again on a $15 minimum wage. He said, I think everyone in D.C. and on this website, Twitter knows, but refuses to say, if 6 to 10 House Democrats said they were voting against the COVID relief bill, unless it includes a minimum wage, the bill would not die. They're going to pass a COVID relief bill regardless. They'd simply have to revise it. Everyone knows this and won't admit it. So what he talked about in the article that he wrote, which this is one of the points he makes in that article, is that basically Joe Manchin, the conservative Democrat from West Virginia, conservative Democratic senator, used his leverage by threatening to withhold a vote for the COVID relief bill to get provisions that he didn't like struck from the bill. Namely, he didn't want a wage increase in it. So he used his leverage as just one person to pressure the Senate to exclude the minimum wage increase from the bill. And none of the people who said they favored a minimum wage increase, not Bernie Sanders, not AOC, not Ro Khanna, nobody was willing to do the same thing. You threatened to withhold their vote from the COVID relief bill unless it did include a minimum wage. So, and this happens over and over, that Republicans or right-wing corporate Democrats are perfectly willing to throw their weight around in Congress, use their ability to withhold their vote, for example, to pressure Congress into doing things to their liking. But the progressive wing in Congress is simply unwilling to do that. It's happened time and time again over the years. It happened with Medicare for All. It's happened with living wage. I'm sure if I thought about it long enough, I could give you other examples. But in any case, the point is, we've got a group of legislators in Congress who say that they're for progressive social change, but don't do anything about it. So, okay, well, I didn't have anything highlighted here, so not really any point in talking about this article. So I'll just go back to me. So in conclusion, if we want change to happen in this country, if we want a living wage, which $15 an hour is really not a living wage, we need more than that. If we want universal health care, if we want to end foreign wars and you spend that money on domestic policy, if we want a Green New Deal, or whatever you want to call environmental reforms that eliminate the use of fossil fuels and turn us toward green energy. If we want any social progress in this country, we simply cannot rely on members of Congress or politicians. No matter how progressive they say they are, no matter how many times they tweet that, yeah, I'm in favor of a Medicare for all, I'm in favor of Green New Deal, I'm in favor of a living wage. Tweeting doesn't get the job done. The only way that powerful people concede to people's desires for progressive social change, as Frederick Douglass put it more than a century ago, is if the people demand it. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. And if our progressive legislators are not willing to demand, to use their leverage that they have as powerful members of the highest governing body in this country, to force progressive policies onto the table, bring them up for a vote, get massive publicity about them, get people talking about them, and actively participate in building a movement for change, which they say they want to do, then we're not going to, if we depend on them, we're not going to get anywhere. The only way that change happens in this country, change for the better, is with a grassroots movement for change. That's how we ended slavery. That's how women got the right to vote. That's how we got an environmental protection agency, into the Vietnam War, brought about the right of gay and lesbian people to get married. And that's how universal health care has been, or a living wage, or free college, or other things that we want but don't have. That's how they've happened in other countries. That's how they will happen here. There's nobody who's going to get elected to Congress anytime in the foreseeable future, or to the presidency, that we can rely on to be our champion for change. If we want change, if we want progress, it's up to us. We are the leaders that we've been looking for. Okay, I hope you've enjoyed the program. I will talk to you next time.